Thank you for joining us today. I am Bruce Goldstein. I'm president of Farmworker Justice. Welcome to the Facebook program series, The State of Farm Workers in America in the COVID-19 Era. Farm workers have been designated essential workers to ensure our nation's food security during the COVID-19 pandemic, yet their working and living conditions create grave risks to their health and economic status. These programs raise awareness about the serious challenges the pandemic imposes on farm workers and their family members each and every day. The series will identify impactful work and innovative ideas being carried out by Farmworker Justice and other organizations that represent and serve farm workers. I've been asked, what is Farmworker Justice? So before we turn to our guest, I'll tell you a little bit. Farmworker Justice is a national advocacy, litigation, and education organization based in Washington, D.C. We serve the interests of farm workers and their family members. That is, the people who labor on farms and ranches. We focus our work on immigration policy, labor rights, occupational safety, health and access to health care, and access to the justice system. In addition to advocacy and litigation, we help provide capacity building assistance to farm worker groups around the country. We do a lot of public education, and we work on corporate social responsibility initiatives as well. So we thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll visit our website, www.farmworkerjustice.org. We have a wealth of information on that website. We have a dedicated page to COVID-19 about what's going on, what we and others are doing to help farm workers prevent and confront the pandemic. We can't do our work without your support, and we appreciate your support. You can make a tax-deductible donation on our website or send a donation by mail to the address in Washington, D.C. that you'll see on the website. Again, thank you for joining us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce a colleague of mine, Senior Staff Attorney Iris Figueroa. Iris leads our work on immigration policy. She's an attorney who's been with us for more than 3 years. She has over 10 years of experience as an attorney. And she'll be telling us about the intersection between immigration policy and the challenges that farm workers are facing during the pandemic. So thank you for being here today, Iris.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be able to talk to to our audience about some of these pressing issues.
So as I said, in your role at Farmworker Justice, you're heavily involved in discussions and collaborations with organizations throughout the country and on Capitol Hill and in the administration around immigration issues. So please tell our listeners, why is immigration such an important issue for farm workers?
Sure, for the very simple reason that most farm workers are immigrants. About half of them, although probably more, are undocumented immigrants. So the lack of immigration status and the fear of retaliation that could be in the form of immigration enforcement is a fear and a reality in their daily lives. That makes it harder for them to speak up if there's unfair or unsafe labor practices at their job, and it can also make it harder for them to access needed services for themselves or for their families.
Thank you. And we have a very dysfunctional immigration system. We call farm workers essential workers to our food supply, but our immigration system denies at least half of them, and really more than half of them, the ability to have a true immigration status and a path to citizenship. So, Iris, what changes in immigration policy have farm worker advocates like Farmworker Justice and our many partners been seeking from Congress recently?
So one of the main ones, both recently and throughout our history, that we've been advocating for is a path to permanent legal status and citizenship for farm workers, for the reasons that I just mentioned before. We believe that those who are quite literally feeding our country should be able to be equal members of the country that they feed, whether they are farm workers that have been here for decades with their families, or guest workers who come year after year to support our agricultural sector. Farmworker Justice and other farm worker organizations are supporting a bipartisan bill in Congress. It passed the House back in December. It's called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And that bill would provide a path to legal status and citizenship for undocumented farm workers. And it would also make some changes to the H-2A agricultural visa program.
Thank you. And I should tell our audience that Iris and our colleagues have prepared a fact sheet on the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, as well as fact sheets on several other proposals in Congress, most of which we strongly oppose because they are very anti-immigrant and anti-worker. So if you visit our website under the Resource Center and look for legislative proposals, you'll find that you can read a lot about these issues. So a lot of people have been reading about the H-2A agricultural guest worker program in the news, but many people don't know anything about it. Tell our listeners, what is the H-2A program?
Sure. So for those who are not familiar with the H-2A program, it's a temporary visa program where foreign workers, mostly from Mexico, but also from many other countries, come into the US to do seasonal agricultural work here in the US. And it's a program that has been around for a few decades, but it has been growing very, very rapidly in the past decade. And for example, just last fiscal year, there were over 250,000 positions certified under the program. So agricultural employers are increasingly turning to this program. The way that the program is set up is that it's a non-immigrant visa, and the visa is controlled by the employer. So that sets up a situation where there's a pretty big power imbalance between the employer and the employee, and it makes workers vulnerable to a lot of abuse. And in fact, Farmworker Justice and a lot of our partner organizations have issued various reports and other information on some of the abuses that occur under the program. So that includes anything from wage theft, discrimination, unsanitary housing conditions, unsafe working conditions, and even human trafficking.
Thanks. And to put the H-2A program into a little bit more context, I'll just say that there are an estimated 2.5 million farm workers in the country, though no one really knows for sure. So if there are 250,000 H-2A guest workers approved in 2019, that means that they were roughly 10% of the farm labor force. So let's move on now, Iris, to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting immigrant farm workers, including H-2A guest workers and their families.
So COVID is just the latest example of how the living and working conditions for farm workers, including H-2A workers, can pose some serious threats to their health. So as you mentioned before, Bruce, farm workers in the agricultural sector have officially been designated as essential during this crisis, but the government's focus has been on making sure that employers have the employees that they need and not on making sure that those employees that are continuing to do this essential work are protected. So among the many challenges that they face, we know that workers are still out in the fields working in close proximity. Many of them are not being given adequate personal protective equipment. Bathrooms, field sanitation, hand washing stations are also an issue where they're not being given what they need, even under normal circumstances. And then when you have a crisis and a disease like COVID, then it becomes even more important that they be provided with that. My colleague Alexis Guild, who was on the show earlier this week, talked about the difficulty accessing healthcare, and that's another challenge that has always been there, but that has been exacerbated by COVID. Workers often lack health insurance, they live in remote areas, they don't have transportation, they make very low wages, they may speak other languages, not just Spanish, but indigenous languages. So all of those things make it hard for them to get medical care under normal circumstances, and might make it very hard for them now to get COVID testing or treatment that they may need. And unfortunately, though, unsurprisingly, we've already become aware of some cases of COVID among farm workers, including H-2A workers.
Right. There's a media report in the last day and a half that 36 farm workers at a large fruit operation in Washington State tested positive out of 71 workers who were tested at the company. And these workers came in under the H-2A agricultural guest worker program. And they are not guaranteed health care. So it's a real challenge. We have said to the Trump administration, you know, you're making it easier to bring in H-2A guest workers this year because they've closed down a lot of the visa processing for other visas, but they've allowed the visa processing to happen for employers to bring in H-2A workers. And the workers often come in on crowded buses and are placed in crowded housing. And we're saying that the administration has an obligation to require these employers who benefit from these guest workers' labor to impose safety and health obligations consistent with the CDC recommendations around COVID-19. And unfortunately, despite a lot of pressure, the administration has not responded positively. So let's move on to the economic stimulus legislation that has been passed by Congress recently. Some of it has actually been of some value to some farm workers. Can you tell us how the economic stimulus packages so far have affected farm workers?
So Congress has passed various pieces of legislation recently in response to the COVID crisis, and there are some provisions in these bills that might be helpful for farm workers. So among them, there's some funding for COVID testing, some funding for rural and migrant health centers that serve farm workers. There's paid sick leave provisions for workers that are very important. There's been an expansion of unemployment insurance, and then there's also been the individual economic stimulus payments.
Thanks. And of course, one of the problems of the unemployment compensation is that undocumented immigrants, no matter how many years they've been working in the United States, are not eligible for unemployment compensation. So there are farms that are losing business because they mostly sell to restaurants that are closed. And so workers who are laid off from such farms can't get unemployment compensation if they are undocumented immigrants. On the sick leave, the paid sick leave is a very helpful thing, but basically employers with fewer than 50 workers are not going to be covered, and employers with more than 500 workers are not covered. So there are a lot of people who are left out of the economic stimulus package. And of course, what we'd like to see is hazard pay for these essential workers who are being told, we want you to work, go to work, but at the same low wages that you usually earn.
And Bruce, just to clarify, it's workers with more than 500 or fewer than 50.
Employers with more than 500 workers need not provide paid sick leave, right? And or if they have fewer than 50. Are there other gaps that I didn't bring up?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So the main one, which you referenced with unemployment insurance, but applies to various different provisions in these bills, including the economic stimulus, for example, where it's requiring a social security number, is that undocumented workers are unable to access, unfortunately, a lot of the advances that have been made in these bills. And as I mentioned before, a significant proportion of farm workers are undocumented. So anytime that undocumented workers are being excluded from provisions of any of these bills, that's going to affect a large number of farm workers. But there's also other gaps and other issues that just haven't been addressed at all. For example, OSHA has not issued a standard on COVID-19 workplace safety. So we, along with a group of advocates across all different sectors, are really trying to pressure OSHA to do that and to make sure that there's clear standards in place. We also believe that farm workers, along with other workers that are continuing to work during this crisis, should be given hazard pay. And so those are two things among many other things that we're advocating for in future COVID legislation.
And all of this would be helped if we could just pass that immigration legislation to grant immigration status to undocumented farm workers and their families. So please tell our audience how they and all of us could help farm workers through our advocacy on these kinds of issues.
Sure. So I think it's really important for people to advocate for farm workers. I think one positive development among the few positive developments that we've seen in this crisis is greater awareness from people about the importance of farm workers in the food sector in our economy, and about the role of immigrants in that, and their essential role in producing the food that keeps us healthy and fed and safe. And so I think we need to be advocating for farm workers regardless of immigration status, both at the federal level, but also at the state level. We know there's been a lot of state level efforts, and some states are stepping up where the federal government unfortunately hasn't been. But also beyond this crisis, we really need to advocate to fix some of the long-term structural problems that are the reason why farm workers are being impacted so acutely in this crisis. So of course, immigration reform is one big issue, and fixing our broken immigration system, but also removing historical exclusions of farm workers from many key labor laws. Improving health and safety standards for farm workers so that they're not exposed to pesticides or heat stress or issues that have already affected their health and made them predisposed to have complications from this virus and from this crisis.
Right, and it just points out that all of the many challenges that farm workers face when they go to work each and every day to feed us, they still exist during the pandemic crisis. We continue to advocate on those issues as well. And although it's not about immigration, Iris, why don't you tell our listeners about the pesticide safety issue that's going on right now regarding pesticide application spraying at the
Sure.
EPA?
So very briefly, so another issue that we work on in addition to immigration is occupational safety and health. And for farm workers, one big issue is pesticide exposure, just because of the nature of their work, obviously. And so there's a regulation, a federal regulation that sets out the standards that employers have to abide by to make sure that workers are protected from pesticide exposure. And so that was revised recently, and we've been fighting along with other advocates to make sure that that's implemented and that it's not weakened and rolled back. But there is still one provision that's still possibly going to be rolled back. It's something called the AEZ, the Application Exclusion Zone. And what it is a buffer zone around where the pesticide is being sprayed to make sure that bystanders, to make it much less likely that bystanders might be affected either directly or through drift. So unfortunately, the EPA is considering weakening that. And so along with a lot of other farm worker and environmental advocates, we've been pushing back against that to make sure that we are able to keep those minimal protections, basic protections, to try and lessen the exposure of farm workers.
Thank you. One of the important strategies that farm worker justice engages in on all of these issues is to support and work with farm worker organizations on the ground. One of the solutions to all of these issues is working with farm labor unions and worker centers and other farm worker serving organizations that are helping farm workers by giving them a voice at work, giving them a voice in policy issues. So we encourage our viewers to look out for those organizations and to be supportive, because the truth is that these policy issues, let's see, I don't know if my video has maybe gone off, but anyway, the policy issues that we work on are advanced when workers gather together and make demands on policymakers as a group. So I want to thank my guest, Iris Figueroa, Senior Staff Attorney at Farmworker Justice, for joining us to talk about immigration policy today. And I want to thank our viewers and listeners for joining us as well. And we'll see you tomorrow, Friday, when we will be interviewing the mayor of Coachella, California. Stephen Hernandez comes from a farm worker background and is the mayor of a city in the Coachella Valley, which may be now known more for a music festival, but is actually a major agricultural production area and farm worker community. So until then, thank you.
Thank you.